This video was sponsored by Card Kingdom. You can visit their store by using my referral link in the description below. Hi everyone, I'm Nitzahone, and it's Wednesday, so that means it's time for another deck history. In this series, I look at the history of deck archetypes that have been successful at Magic's highest level of competition, starting from the first time a particular deck emerged and ending with the modern day. As usual, I ran a poll to let my viewers decide what the topic of this week's video would be, and people most wanted to see me discuss Infect. I was a little surprised Infect won so handily, because I feel that Infect is one of the more polarizing decks to have ever existed, though much of this impression is simply based on comments people have left on various videos on this channel about how broken Infect is and how much they hate it, so maybe those especially salty people are what has skewed my perception. Anyway, Infect decks get their name from the Infect mechanic, which was introduced in 2010's Scars of Mirrodin. Flavor-wise, it was meant to reflect the spread of Phyrexian completion throughout the plane of Mirrodin. Infect makes it so a creature no longer does actual damage, but instead, it deals damage to players in the form of poison counters, and damage to creatures in the form of -1/-1 counters. If a player gets 10 poison counters, they lose the game on the spot. It should be noted that Infect was not the first time poison counters were used in Magic, with several older cards, like Pit Scorpion, also offering that alternate win condition. These older cards that gave players poison counters always put a fixed number of poison counters on the opponent instead of putting one poison counter for each damage that a creature did, so Infect creatures were, in most ways, a souped-up version of these older poison creatures. Poison as an alternate win condition makes it so that playing all Infect creatures means you only have to do half the damage to your opponent that you normally would. Infect decks are built around playing one or two cheap creatures with Infect, protecting those creatures, and pumping their stats so that they can win the game in one or two swings. That's obviously quite powerful, so much so that Infect decks have found significant multi-format success. At one time or another, Infect has been relevant in Block, Modern, and Legacy, and in this video we'll take a look at the origins of the Infect deck in each of these formats, how they changed over time, and why. An Infect deck first top-8'd a premier event at the Scars of Mirrodin Block Pro Tour. This was a format where only cards from the three sets in the block were legal. These were Scars of Mirrodin, Mirrodin Besieged, and New Phyrexia. As I mentioned earlier, Infect was introduced in the block, so it makes sense that a block-constructed Infect deck would be pretty good. Gaudenus Vidugiris piloted a mono-black Infect deck to a top 8 finish at the Block Pro Tour, and the deck was pretty much what you'd expect of Infect. It ran 16 creatures with Infect in various ways to make their stats even better, so they could kill the opponent more quickly. Those creatures included Echor Claw Myr, which would get larger when it was blocked, Phyrexian Crusader, which came with protection and first strike as well as Infect, Plague Stinger, which also had flying, and Whispering Spectre, which brought along evasiveness, as well as potentially giving you a way to make your opponent discard cards, sometimes their whole hand. In addition to these cards, there were always creatures. The deck also used Ink Moth Nexus, a creature land that could become a 1/1 flyer with Infect. So, as you can see, there's a lot of evasiveness on these Infect creatures, so interacting with most of them in combat is not very easy. This was made even more of a problem by cards like Piston Sledge and Mutagenic Growth, which could allow you to very quickly pump up the power of your Infect creatures. The fact that you could cast Mutagenic Growth without any mana at all was awesome, because your opponent just didn't know how big these creatures were going to get in combat. In addition to having a bunch of Infect creatures and ways to pump them, the deck also featured a few ways to make sure the coast was clear if you were going to go all in on finishing the opponent off in a single turn. Gaudenus ran both Despise and Gitaxian Probe to serve this purpose, with both also offering additional upside. Despise could remove something from their hand, and Probe could also draw you a card. So, Gaudenus' deck had three main elements: Infect creatures, ways to pump them, and ways to make sure the coast was clear for you to try to win the game. These elements would continue to be key in Infect decks going forward. As usual, there was only one Block Pro Tour, so no other Infect decks top-8'd a Scars of Mirrodin premier event, but Infect decks have a pretty long history since their debut at Pro Tour Nagoya in 2011. However, it is notable that Infect decks didn't really take hold in Standard. The best finish that was ever managed in that format was a top 16 at Grand Prix Barcelona in 2011. I'm not going to go super deep on this deck since it didn't top 8 the event, but you can see that this Standard version of Infect was much more of a control deck that won the game with larger Infect creatures, rather than a deck that ran small Infect creatures and sought to pump them. While the history of Infect in Standard isn't very impressive, there are two other formats where Infect became one of the more prominent decks around, both Legacy and Modern. Let's take a look at Modern first, since chronologically, it was the next format where Infect decks became Tier 1. Sam Black was the first to pilot an Infect deck to a top 8 finish in Modern, and he did it at Pro Tour Philadelphia in 2011. Sam's deck was significantly different from either of the first two Infect decks we've looked at, mostly because it was pretty much all in on a combo kill with Infect creatures. The only cards that let you put poison counters on your opponent in the whole deck were Blighted Agent and Inkmoth Nexus, but that's all the deck needed. Both of those creatures were difficult to block, which was important since Sam wanted to use Blazing Shoal and pitch either a Dragonstorm or a Progenitus to make one of those two Infect creatures lethal in a single turn. Getting those combo pieces together early was easier than it sounds too, largely because the deck had a lot of ways to filter through cards, and it ran Muddle the Mixture, which could be transmuted to search up either Blighted Agent or the Shoal. Obviously, this combo could be a little risky, but it was offset by the inclusion of a bunch of counter magic. Sam's deck was so powerful, and it could win the game so quickly and consistently, that Blazing Shoal was banned after this Pro Tour. This meant that players wanting to win the game with Poison in Modern had to go back to the drawing board. It was more than a year before another Infect deck top-8'd a premier event in Modern, but Kelvin Chu managed to do it at Pro Tour Return to Ravnica in 2012. This version of the deck is, in some ways, a hybrid between the block version of the deck we looked at and the Modern version of the deck before the banning of Blazing Shoal. It ran far more Infect creatures than earlier Modern decks did, 14 of them if you count Inkmoth Nexus. However, the deck still had some serious combo potential, since it could just win the game out of nowhere with a single creature, though it couldn't do it quite as consistently as the Blazing Shoal version of the deck did. Instead, the deck went heavy into green and ran a critical mass of impressive pump spells to make these Infect creatures put a ton of poison counters on the opponent in a single turn. Groundswell and Might of Old Krosa could each give +4/+4 for only a single green mana, and Vines of Vastwood could be used to protect the creature from removal, and if you kicked it, it could also add an additional +4/+4. The deck also ran Rancor, which could make it so that even if your opponent blocked your Infect creature, they would trample over and win the game. Another important card for the deck was Noble Hierarch, who made it easy for you to have the mana to cast all these pump spells, and because she comes with Exalted, she actually also pumped up your lone Infect creature when it attacked. Similarly, Pendelhaven was basically an upgraded forest in the deck. Since all the Infect creatures started out as 1/1s, it could also contribute poison counters, and that's a pretty sweet thing for a land to do. The deck also had to be sure to run various ways to protect the creature you would be going all in on. This included Vines of Vastwood, as I already stated, as well as Gitaxian Probe, which we saw earlier. Additionally, the deck also used Apostle's Blessing, which could protect your creatures, and also come with the alternate mode of making an Infect creature unblockable on the right board. Modern Infect decks, even to this day, have not changed drastically in the time since Kelvin Chu top-8'd with the deck way back in 2011. But there have been changes over the years, it's just that they mostly amount to switching out a few different pump spells and or Infect creatures, and nothing even close to a complete overhaul of the deck. For example, when Herman Runersson top-8'd Grand Prix Antwerp in 2013, he returned to using Plague Stinger in place of Eager Claw Myr. He also used a few different pump spells, like Distortion Strike, which could make an Infect creature bigger and unblockable, and then do it again on the next turn, and Mutagenic Growth, which we saw earlier but wasn't included in Kelvin Chu's version of the deck, but is a pretty great card for Infect decks since it's 0 mana for +2/+2. Growth was especially important for the deck and has become a staple in modern Infect decks since 2013. The next notable shift for the deck wouldn't come until 2015, when Tom Martell top-8'd Grand Prix Vancouver with an Infect deck featuring several cards that hadn't been in the main deck of earlier Infect decks. Tom's version of the deck had both Wild Defiance and Spellskite in the main deck. These were both cards that had been relegated to the sideboard in earlier decks. Wild Defiance could be a nightmare for decks looking to use things like Lightning Bolt to kill small Infect creatures, because not only could they not kill the creature, it also became larger. It also made your pump spells even more potent. If you were going to win with the help of defense, you were definitely slowing your deck down, but the protection it provided could make it worth it. Meanwhile, Spellskite could just redirect removal spells to itself, and it could do it for free. It provided some excellent additional protection for Infect creatures. Perhaps the most notable inclusion of the deck was the then relatively new Become Immense. Because Infect decks played so many cheap spells, including free ones like Gitaxian Probe and Mutagenic Growth, loading up the graveyard for Become Immense's Delve was pretty much a foregone conclusion, and it often amounts to costing only a single green mana for +6/+6, which is absolutely massive and usually game-ending when you put it on an Infect creature. While Wild Defiance and Spellskite would be featured in the main deck of some future Infect decks, Become Immense would be included in all future versions of modern Infect. Infect decks would undergo the next significant change in Modern in 2016. That year, Infect had its best event in Modern in a very long time, putting up 3 top 8s at Grand Prix Dallas. One new card helped enable this resurgence of Infect, and that was Blossoming Defense, which had been printed in Kaladesh that year. It combined with Vines of Vastwood to give the deck 7 copies of cards that could both protect and pump your creature at the same time, making Infect creatures even harder to kill than they had been before. That pretty much brings us up to today for the Modern format. Earlier this year, an Infect deck top-8'd the Magic Online Modern Championship, and you can see how little it changed from previous incarnations. However, there are a few new cards featured here. There is Snakeskin Veil, another cheap instant that allows you to pump a creature while also saving it from removal, and Scale Up, which can effectively give an Infect creature +5 power for only a single green mana. Additionally, by this point, Gitaxian Probe had been banned, so it was no longer featured in the deck. So, Infect decks have remained remarkably consistent in Modern over the years. While new combat tricks and other key cards have been printed, the game plan and core of the deck has pretty much remained the same since Blazing Shoal got banned out of Modern in 2011. You want to play a cheap Infect creature on turn 1 or 2, make it big, protect it, and kill your opponent in 1 or 2 swings. There is still one format for us to cover though, and that's Legacy. Legacy Infect does not differ drastically from the Modern variant, but there are a few cards that are legal in Legacy but aren't legal in Modern that significantly power up the deck. Most of these are combat tricks. The first Infect deck to top 8 a premier event in Legacy was Tom Ross's deck at Grand Prix Edison in 2014. His deck was called Berserk Poison, and that highlights one of the most important cards in the Legacy version of the deck, Berserk. While it isn't quite Blazing Shoal in terms of its ceiling, it is a lot easier to utilize and has a pretty similar effect. After you pump up your Glistener Elf a ton, you can use Berserk on it, at which point even blocking it probably won't matter. Invigorate was also an important trick that was legal in Legacy, and one that fit perfectly in Infect. You can cast Invigorate for free if you have your opponent gain 3 life, and obviously enough, if you're an Infect deck, your opponent's life total is irrelevant. So this basically amounts to a free +4/+4 spell in Infect. The deck also utilized a lot more blue than Modern versions of the deck, giving it access to counter magic, to even more effectively protect your Infect creatures. We saw that Modern Infect decks haven't changed a whole lot over the years, and that's also true in Legacy. The most recent Legacy deck to top 8 a premier event was Murasi Hiroshi's deck that top 8'd the Legacy Championship in 2018, and you can see that there is very little difference between it and Tom Ross's deck that came more than 4 years earlier. At various times, Infect has been a powerful force in Block, Modern, and Legacy. While the deck isn't really relevant in Legacy these days, Infect is still a very real deck in Modern, and it seems likely that it will continue to be going forward. So, that is the history of Infect decks. If you want to have a say in the deck I cover next week, don't forget to vote in the poll on the Community tab. If you enjoyed this video, please like it and share it so that others can enjoy it too. If you want to make sure you catch future deck histories and other Magic content, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications. And if you want to catch up on previous deck history videos, you should see some playlists on your screen shortly. Lastly, if you enjoy listening to me talk about Magic's history on this channel, consider checking out my other channel, Need to Hone History, where I talk about real-world history. Thanks for watching.